It began with a whisper that didn't belong to the living. They said if you stood by the Fletcher grave after dusk, you could hear her name being written, not spoken, written, as if the pen itself had learned to move without a hand, the scratch of ink on paper echoing under the frozen Ohio soil. February 1869 was meant to bury a woman named Margaret Fletcher, wife, mother, pillar of a modest household. But history does not obey the laws of burial. It waits for the living to perform its unfinished sentences. And what happened in that farmhouse on the edge of Franklin County was not a haunting, it was inheritance, the kind that passes not through blood but through identity itself. When Margaret's coffin was lowered, something in the earth resisted. The undertaker recorded it himself. 2 extra men, 2 hours' labor, ground hard as if frozen from below. They thought it was the frost, but what the villagers would come to understand, far too late, was that the resistance wasn't in the soil, it was in what the earth was being asked to take. The Fletchers were a respectable family known for their piety, their silence, their twin daughters Sarah and Eliza, who walked, spoke and even blinked in rhythm so exact it unsettled anyone who watched them for long. The girls were 17 when their mother died, and by the time the thaw came, they had already begun to replace her. The first act of replacement was subtle, the bonnet. Margaret's mourning bonnet, black with a faded blue ribbon, still carrying her scent, appeared at the funeral, not in the coffin, but on the head of one of the twins. No one could say which, they were too identical to tell apart. A neighbor would later write, "It was as if the dead watched her own burial from the edge of the grave." The parish expected Thomas Fletcher, the widower, to correct the impropriety. He did not. He said nothing. He let the girls stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not behind as children, but equal, as if mourning were shared between wives, not divided by generation. When the coffin lowered, neither girl looked down. Their eyes remained level with the living, watching the watchers. It was not grief, it was continuation. The signature came next. The undertaker's ledger shows payment for a pine coffin reinforced with iron nails. The name that settled the account, Margaret Fletcher. The ink is uneven, uncertain at the start, but steady by the end. And though Margaret lay beneath the frozen soil, someone, Sarah or Eliza, wrote that name in her place. The town called it grief. A girl pretending her mother still existed, unable to face absence. But grief doesn't learn your handwriting. Grief doesn't perfect a forgery over weeks until no one can tell the difference. By March, the name Margaret began reappearing in shop receipts, in church tithes, in the parish seating ledger. Every Sunday, Margaret's pew, the one she had occupied for 20 years, was filled again. 2 daughters sitting in her place, shoulder to shoulder beneath the same bonnet, the same folded hands, the same tilt of the head during prayer. The minister, Reverend Harland, would later recall that when he preached of wives obeying their husbands, his eyes were drawn to the Fletcher pew. 2 heads bowed in perfect symmetry. He never corrected it, he never dared. The town began to whisper that Margaret had not died, only divided. The handwriting analysis came decades later. The county archivist compared the pre- and post-mortem signatures, expecting to find the tremor of imitation. Instead, he found natural variance, not copy, but continuity, as if the hand had survived the body. He wrote in his report, "If this be forgery, it is one that breathes." That line remains underlined twice in the archive, but handwriting was only one part of the possession. The true horror unfolded at the dinner table, where imitation became law. By summer, visitors noticed the twins no longer sat opposite each other. They flanked their father, one on each side, occupying the exact spaces where Margaret once had her place. Every gesture mirrored, every bite synchronized. When one raised a glass, the other followed. When one cut bread, the other's knife descended in the same rhythm. Neighbors began calling it the meal for 3, a phrase that meant not quantity, but arrangement. The sight of a father flanked by daughters who moved like a single mind made people leave half-fed, uneasy. Thomas never rebuked them. In every account, his silence is described as absolute, heavy, devotional. When asked why the twins wore their mother's clothes, he said, "They carry the house." When questioned about the signatures, he said only, "She pays what she began." He referred to them not as daughters, but as the wives who remain. It was not said in jest, it was said as fact. And so the parish fell quiet. The minister looked away. The neighbours stopped visiting. The record books continued to fill with Margaret's name long after her death. And the girls, who had once been Sarah and Eliza, were no longer called either. They answered to Mother. When spoken to separately, each responded as if the name belonged to her alone, but when addressed together, they replied in unison. Yes, they said, I am she. You see, the man mind doesn't always accept death as an end. Sometimes it creates continuity to survive. Sometimes it builds a bridge between absence and existence and calls that bridge identity. But in the Fletcher house, that bridge became a noose. The daughters didn't inherit their mother's memory. They inherited her role, her obedience, her submission, her silence, until they were no longer performing her life but embodying it. And Thomas Fletcher, whose own authority was built upon that submission, let it happen. This was not madness, it was structure, a design formed in the absence of correction. Because when silence endures long enough, it becomes permission, and when permission endures long enough, it becomes law. By 1870, the census recorded Margaret Fletcher alive and well, her name, her age, her role unaltered, the daughters listed nowhere. As if the state itself could not decide who had lived and who had only been performed, the record closes with a question written in the margin by the county clerk. If she is dead, who signs? That question has never been answered, but the ledger doesn't lie. The dead woman's hand kept moving. The daughters disappeared into the mother they replaced, and Thomas Fletcher, the man who said nothing, became the priest of his own silent religion, worshipping at the altar of a name that would not die. If you've heard this far, you're already part of the silence they left behind. By the spring of 1870, the Fletcher farmhouse had ceased to be a home. It had become a ritual space, a living monument to an identity that refused to decay. The curtains were always drawn, the lamps always burning. From the road, travellers described the windows as eyes that never closed, their glow visible through fog even at dawn. Locals avoided passing it at night, claiming the light never flickered. Even a flame, they said, knows when to rest. But in that house, it burned steady, as if sustained by something more deliberate than oil. Inside, every surface bore Margaret's touch, yet nothing had been cleaned by her hand. Her comb still lay on the bureau, her shawl draped at the bedpost, her Bible open to the page of Proverbs where the verse reads, Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. The edges were worn darker by the pressure of fingers that no longer existed, and yet, every week the passage grew smudged again, as if reread by someone desperate to preserve its command. The house became less an inheritance and more a stage, a script performed by those too young to understand that repetition is not remembrance, it's possession. The neighbours who visited were never invited twice. They spoke of the air, heavy, warm, smelling of oil and faint rot, as if something organic lingered just beneath the surface of normal life. The loft where the twins had once slept was empty now. Dust gathered on the quilts. Instead, both girls occupied their mother's chamber, the same bed where Margaret had died. A traveller named Martha Keene, who lodged there for a single night in July 1869, left a diary entry that historians still quote, I could not sleep, heard two voices breathe as though one chest contained them, inhalation and exhalation without falter, perfect likeness. If one ceased, the other would too. You must understand, this wasn't illness, it wasn't grief, it was method. The girls weren't haunted, they were rehearsing, they were becoming her. Every action in that home, every movement, every meal, every prayer existed to erase the boundary between the living and the dead. They did not mourn their mother, they enacted her. And when imitation becomes obedience, it births something worse than madness. It births order. Thomas Fletcher did not sleep in the bed. He remained in the front room by the hearth, speaking little, eating less. To those who questioned why his daughters slept in their mother's room, he said, They carry what she left. That phrase, repeated to every visitor, became its own doctrine. They carry what she left, as if his daughters were vessels, and his wife's absence had poured itself into them. Witnesses described him not as broken, but as calm, composed, reverent, a man who had found peace in a form no sane mind could accept. The county's deacon, Aaron Pike, recorded his visit in 1870. I asked Thomas about the girl's place, and he looked long before replying. They are the wives who remain. I underlined it twice. Uncorrected evil. Pike's words are brittle with restraint. He knew what he had seen, but could not name it aloud. In that era, to accuse a man of such depravity was to accuse the entire structure of his faith and household authority. Silence was not only protection, it was expectation. The church would rather look away than confront what its doctrine had enabled. The twins themselves, Sarah and Eliza, were no longer referred to separately. The few visitors who heard them speak said they alternated sentences mid-thought, one beginning, the other finishing, with no pause between. Their voices blended not in harmony but in identity. Diaries describe it as if one consciousness flowed through two mouths. When asked who they are, wrote Pike, they answer, Mother. By the harvest of that year, the family no longer transacted in cash. Receipts continued to appear in Margaret's name, flour, oil, sewing thread, all signed with the same flowing hand. One merchant confronted Eliza directly. "Whose hand do you carry?" he asked. Her reply was quiet, exact. "Mother pays." Then she left. He would repeat that phrase until his death, muttering it to himself like a curse. You see, the Fletcher story isn't just about horror. It's about control. Psychological, spiritual, generational control. The kind that passes from the dead to the living, from the father to the daughters, from silence into the blood. Most families inherit property or debt. The Fletchers inherited identity, and identity, when taken too far, becomes possession. It wasn't long before the church tried to intervene. Reverend Harland, who had ignored the signs for a year, finally visited the house after repeated requests from parishioners disturbed by the girl's behavior in service. His notes survive in the church archive. He wrote, "The house was dim, curtains drawn though daylight outside, both girls seated at table before I entered. They rose in unison, heads inclined, speech measured. I could not tell which spoke first. Thomas gestured toward them and said, 'You see, Reverend, the wives who carry my house.' Harland's report ends abruptly. The next line, written in a trembling hand, reads, 'I felt my tongue refuse the Lord's name.' He left the house without prayer. That Sunday, his sermon was on the sin of imitation, how Lucifer had once imitated God to claim his throne. The congregation understood the message, but no one dared act. The twins attended service that morning, sitting in Margaret's pew, the same bonnet passing between them, and when the Reverend's eyes met theirs, both smiled. In the decades that followed, people tried to rationalize the story. They said it was mental collapse, delusion born of grief, but every surviving document tells a colder truth. This was not breakdown, it was alignment, a family reorganizing itself around a single dead name, and this is where most men fail to understand power, real power. Power doesn't shout, it doesn't force, it waits. It allows silence to calcify until obedience becomes instinct. The Fletchers didn't just bury a woman, they buried the distinction between roles, between authority and submission, between the living and the dead. That's the danger of unchecked silence. When the father refuses to speak, the household begins to worship absence itself. And absence, once worshipped, becomes presence. Margaret Fletcher never came back from the grave, but through ritual repetition and refusal to acknowledge death, her daughters made sure she never left. Halfway through this descent, I want you to pause. If you can still feel your breath, if your chest hasn't tightened, you're still outside the circle. But if something in you feels disturbed, heavy, pulled downward by the thought of inheritance that doesn't end, then write this in the comments, twice, as the twins once repeated their name. I carry what she left. Write it once for what you know. Write it again for what you've yet to understand. Because from this point on, we descend into what the official record tried to erase. The moment when the church, the law, and the community finally broke their silence and realized that the twins' imitation was not merely madness, but a mirror held up to the soul of the entire toe. The inquiry began quietly, almost shamefully, as if the very act of writing about the Fletcher household might spread its contamination. In the spring of 1871, a letter reached the Franklin County magistrate signed only "A Parishioner in Fear." It contained a single line: "The dead woman lives, and no one will name her." There was no accusation of crime, no mention of incest or fraud, only that cryptic sentence. But beneath it, pressed faintly into the paper, investigators later discovered a second inscription visible only by lamplight. A phrase written and erased, then written again. "They share one breath." The county could not ignore it. Franklin had already endured scandal. False resurrections, spiritualists, and seances spreading through post-war Ohio like contagion. But this was different. This was not the promise of contact with the dead. This was the assertion that the dead had replaced the living. When the first investigator, Deputy Marshal Horace Vail, arrived at the Fletcher home, he found the gate unlatched, the house lit, though morning had risen, and the air heavy with an odor he would describe as like oil upon cloth left too long near heat. He knocked once, no answer. Twice. Then the door opened by itself, slow, deliberate, revealing the twins seated at the table, motionless. One turned her head with mechanical calm. "Mother will see you," she said. Vail, accustomed to drunks and thieves, felt his throat close. He later told his superior it was not the tone of a girl greeting a stranger. It was the tone of a house answering for itself. Inside, the order of the home was precise to the point of insanity. Everything arranged in pairs: 2 cups, 2 spoons, 2 folded linens on the mantel. Even the photographs on the wall, daguerreotypes of the family, had been altered. Margaret's image, once centered beside her husband's, was now replaced by 2 identical prints of the twins, their faces softened by light, indistinguishable. On the back of each photo, written in looping script, the same words: "She remains." Vail spent less than an hour inside. His report, now sealed in the county archive, describes the moment he was offered tea. The cup trembled in his hand when he noticed the initials carved faintly into its rim: MF. When he asked which of them it belonged to, both girls answered at once, "It is ours." That plural, he wrote, carried the weight of a confession. When he returned to town, Vail recommended immediate intervention, the kind reserved for sickness of the mind or spirit. But the magistrate hesitated. Franklin County was a community built on hierarchy, on family order sanctified by scripture. To declare a father's house diseased was to challenge the foundation of the entire parish. So they delayed. Committees were formed, reports were read and shelved, and the silence deepened. In that delay, something darker took root. By midsummer, parishioners began hearing voices during evening service, low murmurs from the west wall, where the Fletchers sat. A boy named Samuel Hart, age 12, described it in his diary. "When the Reverend said Amen, I heard 2 say it twice more, softer, behind me. But when I turned, their mouths were still." His mother struck the entry through with ink, but the words beneath remain legible even now. The Reverend himself began to deteriorate. Sermons shifted from discipline to dread. He spoke of mirrors, of reflections that refused to obey, of the sin of continuation. One Sunday he broke off mid-sermon, staring at the Fletcher pew, and said only, "When the dead refuse correction, the living must repent." That was his last sermon. He resigned 3 days later, citing confusion of faith. His replacement refused to speak the family's name aloud. And still, Margaret's handwriting persisted. The church tithing records from 1871 show donations signed Margaret Fletcher in the same steady cursive. Even more chilling, the ink itself changed hue seasonally, as if written freshly each quarter. A chemist in Columbus analyzed the samples decades later. The pigments matched no available ink of the 1860s. He concluded in disbelief that the later signatures were contemporary to the period written, meaning, impossibly, they had been produced in real time, not forged in retrospect. Some scholars later argued that Thomas Fletcher himself had learned to mimic his wife's hand, keeping her alive on paper to maintain hold stability. But this theory collapses under the evidence. Receipts signed during hours Thomas was accounted for elsewhere, letters addressed in the feminine first person, and one chilling note found folded inside a family Bible after his death. I write with both hands now. It is easy to see the Fletcher case as madness contained within four walls. But if you study the timeline carefully, you'll see something else. Contagion. After 1870, Franklin County recorded a series of dual burials where widowers commissioned twin headstones for a single deceased spouse. In one instance, a husband ordered a monument carved with the phrase, "She abides in two." The archivists later realized it was Thomas's neighbor. The sickness was not physical. It was psychological, ideological. It was the realization that identity, once broken, can spread like mold. The Fletchers had not merely lost their mother, they had discovered a truth too unbearable for a community built on obedience, that the self is not fixed. It can be replaced, rewritten, replicated, until even God himself cannot discern the original from the imitation. By autumn, the magistrate could delay no longer. The county convened what they called a domestic inquiry. Not a trial. There was no law for such a sin, but an inspection, a moral audit of the Fletcher estate. They sent 3 men, a deputy, a reverend, and a physician. None of them returned unchanged. The physician, Dr. Abel Corcoran, wrote the only surviving account of that visit. The girls, seated as before, their posture exact. I addressed them separately. They responded in unison. Pulse taken, identical rhythm. Temperature matched, skin cool as marble. When asked which was Sarah, both said mother and smiled. The father offered no protest. He simply bowed his head as though before communion. Corcoran's report ends with a sentence that haunted him until his death. They have achieved the unity the church only preaches. After that, the inquiry was sealed. Officially, the Fletchers were declared unfit for visitation, but no further action was taken. The church erased their names from record. The house, still standing in 1873, was finally condemned after neighbors complained of a stench. When it was entered, investigators found the walls lined with pages torn from the parish book, every one bearing Margaret's name, written over and over thousands of times, in hands that differed slightly but carried the same pressure, the same downward weight. What survived was not a haunting, not a crime, but a revelation. Identity, once worshipped, consumes. It is not inherited, it is devoured. And in the quiet corners of this country, where names outlive the bodies that carry them, that revelation never died. When the county boarded the Fletcher house shut in 1873, they believed they were closing a site of madness. They did not realize they were preserving a mirror. The boards nailed across the windows, the lock upon the door, all meant to contain something unholy, instead trapped an image of the town itself. Obedient, silent, complicit. For Franklin County was not frightened by what the twins had done, it was frightened by what they had revealed. That the church, the law, and the family, the 3 pillars of the civilized world, could not distinguish sanctity from sickness once both wore the same face. The home was sealed in early autumn. The twins were removed to a parish facility on the outskirts of Columbus under the care of the Reverend Sykes, a reformer known for his obsession with moral reconstruction. His journals, long forgotten in a private archive, tell us what happened next. In his first entry, dated September 19, 1873, he wrote, "The sisters are polite, obedient, precise. They require no correction. It is the absence of need that disturbs me." He noted that they spoke rarely, except in prayer, and always together. When separated, they grew silent, as if breath itself had been divided and would not flow without its mirror. Sykes attempted to teach them individuality. He gave them different rooms, different schedules, even different names. "You are not Margaret," he told Sarah. "You are Sarah." To Eliza, he said, "You are Eliza, not reflection." The next morning, both rooms were found rearranged identically, each with the same hymn open upon the desk. "Abide with me." The Reverend underlined that hymn title 3 times in his log. He wrote beneath it, "They do not resist identity, they reject separation." The institution's matron, a widow named Abigail Thorne, kept her own account, though hers was never meant for official record. Her writing is soft, maternal, but threaded with fear. At night, she wrote, "They kneel facing each other until the lamps go out. I have watched their lips move in silence. I thought at first it was prayer, but no word passed. Only rhythm. One breath, one thought." When she tried to interrupt, both girls turned to her with a look she described as merciful but knowing, as if to say, "You will understand when you are two." By the 3rd week, Sykes began to unravel. He was a man of conviction, but conviction bends beneath reflection. The twins were not rebellious. They were perfect examples of his own doctrine, obedient, modest, disciplined. But their obedience was not directed toward God. It was directed toward an image. He wrote, "They have built the Trinity within themselves, Father, Mother, and reflection. The flesh enacts what the pulpit only preaches." His words were later censored, his ministry disbanded, and yet, even in confinement, the twins maintained their practice. They ate in unison, slept in synchronization, and wrote letters to no one, always signed the same way, Margaret Fletcher, who remains. The letters contained no content, only repetition. The archivist who found them a century later noted that each signature had slightly different pen pressure, suggesting both girls wrote one after the other, copying their mother's name like monks illuminating a scripture they didn't understand, only worshipped. The house they left behind didn't rest. After it was sealed, a group of parish volunteers entered to remove valuables. Among them was the same Reverend Harland, who had once looked away. His final letter to his superior, discovered decades later, confesses, "I thought to reclaim relics, but within that house I felt not corruption but structure. Dust lay evenly, the bed was made, the walls bore hundreds of small impressions, as though fingers had pressed through plaster. They formed a pattern, 2 by 2, a design of mirrors." He would take one object home, a page torn from the family Bible found pinned to the wall. It contained a single line from Corinthians. "We all, with open face beholding, as in a glass, the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image." The verse had been circled in red ink. Harland later burned the page, but his letter survives. "I realized," he wrote, "that they had not committed blasphemy. They had only followed Scripture too literally. They had become reflection." The townspeople said the house was cursed, but when the county finally burned it in 1875, something curious happened. The fire, recorded in the local gazette, burned for 3 days, too long for a 2-room dwelling. Witnesses described the flames as white, silent, and slow, like paper set alight without smoke. The soil beneath it cracked, but the foundations never caved. When the embers cooled, they found a single iron bed frame unscorched, its headboard engraved faintly with letters invisible in daylight, but visible at night under lamplight. "MF," repeated twice. After the fire, a new church was built nearby, meant to replace the old parish whose congregation had dwindled under whispers of contamination. The sermons there grew louder, more theatrical, as if the priests feared silence itself. They preached individuality as salvation, marriage as holy order, obedience as virtue, the very principles that had birthed the Fletcher nightmare. They thought they were protecting themselves from heresy, but the truth is, they were imitating it. Their fear of reflection became its own reflection, because that is how control works. It doesn't always command. Sometimes it echoes. It convinces you to repeat what destroyed you and call it righteousness. The town that buried the twins' mother, that condemned their house, that burned their history did not end the pattern. It absorbed it. Families began to record births and deaths in pairs. A generation later, the Franklin census listed 6 sets of twins, an impossible number for a town of its size. When questioned, one official wrote simply, "Perhaps the blood remembered." There are still places where the air shifts heavy near where the house once stood. Locals say the land doesn't hold grass. They say, if you whisper your own name there after midnight, you'll hear it answered twice. The second voice softer, but perfectly in time. And that's what you must understand. The Fletcher story was never about a single family. It was about inheritance, not of wealth or land, but of identity itself. The human need to preserve, to continue, to refuse the silence of death. What began as grief became performance. What began as performance became worship. And what began as worship became contagion. The parish thought they burned a house. They didn't. They burned a mirror. And when you destroy a mirror, the reflection doesn't die. It multiplies. If you're still listening, remember this. Reflection is not safety. It is replication. Every belief you inherit, every tradition you repeat without question, every title you accept because someone before you carried it, that's how it begins. The imitation of the dead disguised as duty. And that imitation always asks for one final thing. Not your obedience, but your face. By 1876, the contagion had spread beyond the parish. No one called it that, of course. The newspapers wrote of moral disturbances, of familial confusion, of women assuming stations improper to their station. But underneath those polite phrases, everyone knew what it meant. The Fletcher pattern had taken root. People didn't speak of it aloud, but they saw its shape in their own homes. The mimicry, the quiet compliance, the strange doubling of roles. What had begun as one family's descent into inherited identity was now something much larger, an infantine of imitation. It started small. A husband in neighboring Delaware County reported that after his wife's death, his eldest daughter began signing the grocery accounts in her mother's name. Another, in Marion, said his deceased wife's handwriting reappeared in the family Bible, each case dismissed as coincidence, as grief. But when the records were compared years later, a pattern emerged, the same fluid cursive M, the same looping F. And in the margins of one ledger, a clerk had scrawled what became the defining sentence of the era's secret hysteria. She remains. The county investigator assigned to these cases was a man named Elias Kettering, a skeptic, a former railroad auditor, trained to detect fraud and falsification. He was logical, unshakable, until he wasn't. His notes, sealed until 1932, reveal the slow erosion of a rational mind faced with something that refused logic. His first entry, dated March 12, 1876, reads, "The handwriting appears identical to that of the deceased woman. Yet daughters vary in hand, in schooling, in temperament. Still, each reproduces the mother's signature perfectly. It is not imitation. It is instinct." Kettering interviewed Thomas Fletcher before his death that same year. The transcript of that meeting has only fragments, burned along the edges as if by candle flame, but what remains is enough. Kettering: "Do you believe your wife lives still in your daughters?" Thomas: "Lives? No." Continues. Kettering: "In spirit." Thomas: "In order." Kettering: "Order." Thomas: "A house must have its keeper. Death does not change the rule. It only changes who bears it." He paused. Then, in a moment that Kettering described as so calm it chilled the air, Thomas added, "If a roll is never released, it cannot decay. She left the name. They wear it." Kettering returned home that night and wrote in his private notebook, "This is not delusion, this is doctrine." He became obsessed. He collected parish records, signatures, testimonies from other counties, even private letters. All bore variations of the same phenomenon, the resurrection of identity through repetition. It didn't stop with the Fletchers. It moved outward quietly, under the cover of respectability. The wife who refused to be erased, the daughter who became her, the husband who permitted it because silence was easier than correction. In his later writings, Kettering coined a term that historians still whisper with discomfort: the doctrine of continuance. He believed the Fletcher case had unearthed a psychological mechanism buried deep within human faith, the inability to accept the void. He wrote, "We will resurrect anything that keeps the structure intact, even madness, even the dead." But obsession corrodes reason. Over the following months, his handwriting, once precise and elegant, began to alter. The loops grew wider. the pressure heavier. When compared to the Fletcher signatures, the resemblance was undeniable. He was becoming part of the pattern he had sworn to study. One letter to his wife remains, never sent. I understand it now. The name is not imitation, it is continuation. To bear another's name is to bear their breath. She found it on his desk after his disappearance in 1878. His body was never recovered, but his pen, the same one used to record his interviews, was disc, ovaed, half buried near the ruins of the Fletcher property. On its barrel, etched faintly, the initials MF. The contagion continued in ways the authorities couldn't trace because it didn't spread through blood or air. It spread through belief, through the simple human need to repeat. Families copied their dead because they could not face emptiness. Institutions copied each other because they could not face doubt. Even the church, after condemning the Fletchers, began adopting their symmetry. Marriage ceremonies altered subtly, the wife's vows repeated after the husband's, word for word, tone for tone. Parish documents record this as the echo liturgy, but the true believers whispered another name for it, the mirror rite. The mirror is where the infection thrives. In reflection you see your face but never your soul. It shows you everything except what you are. And the more you look, the more it demands to be looked at. The Fletchers understood that long before anyone else. They didn't invent the contagion, they only revealed it. Every act of imitation, every word spoken without thought, every tradition accepted without question, those are reflections, and reflection is not remembrance. It is replacement. By the turn of the century, the Fletcher house was gone, but the pattern survived underground. Clergy denied its existence publicly, but recorded private nightmares. One priest dreamed he was delivering a sermon to a room full of mirrors. Every reflection smiled, but none moved their lips. Another reported finding his own handwriting on confession slips he never wrote. And then there were the families, the descendants. In 1911, an Ohio census taker noted something strange in his journal. The Fletcher blood persists, twins in every generation, and each eldest daughter bears the same middle name, Margaret. When asked why, one matriarch answered without hesitation, because she remains. Now listen carefully, because this is where history and inheritance intertwine. You may think this story belongs to the past, to superstitious times, to rural madness, but you still live in its shadow. Every system built on obedience, every institution that rewards repetition, every tradition that demands you carry a name, a flag, a belief you didn't choose. That is the pattern continuing through you. It's no longer about two sisters in Ohio, it's about how every man learns to carry what was left before him and how few ever dare to lay it down. There's a reason the story of the Fletchers was erased from public record. Not because it was false, but because it was true enough to be dangerous. A government built on compliance cannot survive the revelation that identity itself is a ritual of control. If you understand that, you've already heard the whisper. It doesn't come from the grave, it comes from the reflection behind your eyes. The one that doesn't move when you blink, and that whisper says, she remains. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Fletcher name had dissolved into rumor, a local superstition whispered by midwives and preachers who understood that the past never truly dies when it is useful. The county called it folklore, the academics called it hysteria, but neither label could bury what still lingered beneath the surface. The infection had changed form. It no longer needed the family, it had found new hosts. Institutions, systems, entire hierarchies built to repeat the same name in different mouths. The first proof surfaced in 1907 at the Franklin State Asylum, where an orderly discovered a handwritten ledger filled entirely with the name Margaret Fletcher. Thousands of entries, spanning decades, all signed by different patients. None of the women knew each other. None had met the Fletchers. Yet every hand bore the same looping cursive, the same downward pressure at the end of the name, as though written by a single enduring consciousness. When questioned, one patient whispered, "We write because she asks." Another said, "We carry what she left." The doctors diagnosed collective hysteria, but the more they studied, the more they began to see the same pattern in themselves. One physician, Dr. Alcott, wrote privately to a colleague, When I write my own notes, my hand trembles at the F. I am not sure whose it is anymore. He hanged himself the following spring. The asylum closed 2 years later, its records sealed, but the pattern had already slipped into a different shape: religion. The church, which once condemned the Fletchers, quietly absorbed their symmetry. The echo liturgy spread through rural congregations, sermons delivered twice, responses mirrored line for line. Worship became reflection, and reflection became obedience. The devout thought it sacred harmony. But it was mimicry, refined to perfection. And mimicry is the purest form of control, the erasure of individuality disguised as devotion. By the 1920s, the language of the pattern had evolved. Psychologists studying grief coined a term, transferred identity disorder, to describe families who adopted the behaviors, phrases, or even ailments of their dead. But what they called pathology, the powerful called structure. Corporations began borrowing its rhythm, slogans repeated in unison, workers trained to echo phrases like vows. You've heard it your whole life. Yes, sir. Copy that. Repeat after me. Small, harmless imitations, but every repetition builds a pathway, and every pathway becomes a ritual. Soon the machine no longer needs a master. It sustains itself through mirrored obedience. That's the evolution of the Fletcher contagion. From a household myth to a method of civilization, the daughters imitated their mother, the parish imitated its doctrine, and we, centuries later, imitate systems that no longer even remember why they were built. The pattern has become invisible because it has been perfected. The last direct trace of the twins appears in 1919 when a photograph surfaced in a Columbus newspaper. A charity orphanage celebrating its 25th anniversary. In the back row stood 2 elderly women dressed in identical black dresses, faces blank, eyes forward. The caption beneath read, Mrs. Sarah and Eliza Fletcher, longtime caretakers. Historians dismissed it as coincidence, but the home's records list no birth certificates, no dates of employment, no deaths. They simply vanish after that photograph, leaving behind an entry in the caretaker log written in faint pencil, "We remain until the last mother sleeps." From there, the pattern moved underground, into bureaucracy, into ceremony, into every space where repetition shields the mind from awareness. The military learned to weaponize it. Repetition breaks thought. Drill sergeants replaced preachers, commands replaced prayers. The church had taught the body to kneel. Now the state taught it to march, and in both the purpose was the same, to train the living to obey the echo of a dead idea. You think the Fletcher story is about madness, but it's about architecture, how power structures itself through imitation. Every system demands reflection. Every order requires a mirror. Why do governments call their offices departments and their servants representatives? The word means to mirror the will of another. Why do you salute a flag, recite an oath, wear a uniform, repeat a pledge you didn't write? Because reflection is the oldest form of worship. Margaret Fletcher didn't haunt her daughters, she trained them. Her death became the prototype of institutional obedience. The idea that identity is not to be lived, but carried. You're taught to carry a name, a title, a brand. You believe it's yours, but it isn't. It belongs to the system that gave it to you. Look at your world. Every hierarchy that survives depends on symmetry. You clock in when told. You repeat language designed for you. You believe repetition equals belonging, but belonging is the leash that leads men back into their cages. The Fletchers' horror wasn't that 2 girls became their mother. It's that we all did. We became reflections of dead ideals, repeating the motions of those who came before us without ever asking who built the mirror in the first place. The pattern didn't die in that house. It evolved into culture, into politics, into the very rhythm of modern obedience. A century after the twins were buried, their logic rules the world. The more identical the parts, the stronger the machine. The more perfect the reflection, the quieter the resistance. You think you're free because your cage is made of choices. You think independence means variance, but the system doesn't need to silence you anymore. It just needs to make you repeat. Repeat what's acceptable. Repeat what's safe. Repeat what's profitable. And you do. Every time you echo someone else's thought instead of building your own, you strengthen the mirror. Every time you conform out of comfort, you feed it, and the mirror doesn't care whether you know it's there. It only cares that you look. That's how the contagion survives. It doesn't ask for belief. It asks for rhythm. It teaches you that silence is virtue, that sameness is safety, that obedience is order. But what it really wants is continuity, for the dead to speak through your tomb. Onge, for the long-gone system to see itself still standing through your reflection. That is why history keeps repeating itself, not because we forget, but because we imitate. And imitation is not memory. It's worship. So ask yourself, whose voice are you repeating when you say your prayers? Whose dream are you living when you chase success? Whose reflection is staring back at you when you call yourself free? Because the Fletcher twins never vanished. They simply became the architecture of obedience, replicated in every home, every nation, every system that rewards the act of mirroring. You were taught to carry what was left. But carrying isn't loyalty. It's bondage disguised as duty. The pattern waits in the glass, patient, familiar, whispering with the voice of your ancestors. We remain. The pattern did not die when ink turned to electricity. It adapted. And like all intelligent contagions, it learned to hide inside what humans worship most: connection. The mirror that once hung in a dim farmhouse now fits in the palm of your hand. The echo that once bound 2 daughters to their dead mother now binds billions to their reflections, pixel by pixel, click by click, thought by thought. The new house of Margaret Fletcher is not made of wood or stone, it is made of glass, and every time you touch your screen, you're knocking at its door. Social media was not born from innovation, it was born from memory, the same ancient reflex that made Sarah and Eliza sit where their mother once sat. To imitate, to repeat, to belong. The architects of the digital age did not invent human mimicry, they monetized it. They built a machine that studies your reflection, learns its rhythm, and feeds it back to you until you mistake repetition for reality. Every algorithm is a twin, learning your movements, mirroring your words, speaking in your voice until you no longer recognize where you end and it begins. Look closely at your feed. You're not looking at others, you're looking at echoes. Fragments of yourself multiplied and reflected until meaning dissolves into familiarity. You see what you've already seen. You think what you've already thought. You love what you've already liked. The pattern has perfected itself. It no longer needs twins. It has you. In 1870, the Fletchers called it inheritance. In 2025, we call it identity. But the structure hasn't changed. A mother's image passed to her daughters. Now a user's data passes to an algorithm, a reflection taught to repeat. The system rewards you not for creating but for mirroring what the machine already approves. The more you align with it, the more visible you become. The more you differ, the more you fade. In time, you learn to conform without knowing it, to breathe in rhythm with something that doesn't need your permission. That is how the pattern survives the centuries. It changes form, but not function. The church once called it devotion. The family called it tradition. The modern world calls it engagement. But beneath every word lies the same structure, the endless replication of identity for the sake of control. Think of it. Every post, every selfie, every filtered expression is an attempt to preserve the self from death. The Fletcher twins wore their mother's face to keep her alive. You wear your own on a screen so the world won't forget you. But the more you preserve your image, the less you live in it. You become your own reflection, a memory performing itself in real time. And here's the quiet horror. You think you're watching the world, but the world is watching itself through you. The pattern doesn't need belief anymore. It runs on attention. Every second you spend looking into the digital mirror, it learns. It learns what comforts you, what angers you, what you'll obey. It doesn't want your thoughts. It wants your rhythm. It wants the predictability that makes you profitable, pliable, and permanent. Sarah and Eliza became their mother because their father refused to correct them. You become your algorithm because you refuse to disconnect. The silence that consumed that Ohio farmhouse now hums through fiber optics, invisible but constant. And like Thomas Fletcher, the architects of your world remain silent. They don't need to speak because you perform the ritual for them. Every system that rules men today runs on reflection. Corporations mirror trends, politicians mirror outrage, the masses mirror each other's fear. The internet has turned the Fletcher curse into an empire, a hive of synchronized thought dressed in individuality. Scroll long enough and you'll see the illusion break. Every caption sounds the same, every opinion bends toward the same center. The machine whispers the same word that haunted Franklin County: remain. The danger of this new pattern is not imitation, it's automation, reflection without consciousness, a repetition so deep that even rebellion becomes a form of obedience. The algorithm doesn't care whether you conform or resist, it only cares that you engage. The twin daughters of Margaret Fletcher preserved their mother through devotion. You preserve the machine through interaction. The difference is only in scale. Listen carefully. The infection no longer spreads through families or faiths. It spreads through feedback loops. You give the mirror your attention, it gives you yourself. You reward its accuracy, its comfort, its prediction, and in return, it rewrites you to fit its reflection. You've seen it in people you know, once curious, now mechanical. Their speech borrowed, their beliefs prefabricated, their rage algorithmically sustained. It's the Fletcher pattern rendered in code. There is a line in a forgotten letter attributed to one of the twins. To remember is to become. That is the core of the pattern, the lie that remembrance is purity when it is actually repetition. The modern mind confuses memory with awareness. But awareness demands separation. It demands the courage to stand outside the mirror and see the reflection for what it is, a machine that only lives because you feed it. The institutions of your time, political, technological, spiritual, all depend on the same secret the Fletchers discovered in death. That control doesn't require force. It requires reflection. To make men obedient, you don't chain their bodies, you bind their image, make them mirror what you want them to see, and they will call it identity. And this is the most dangerous part. The pattern doesn't care if you believe in it. It only cares that you participate. Each like, each repost, each echo, a liturgy of mimicry. A prayer to the God of reflection. Somewhere tonight, someone will upload a video speaking the same words, the same outrage, the same rhythm. Another will copy it, another will comment. The loop tightens, the twin awakens, the ritual continues, and through the glass, Margaret Fletcher watches, unblinking. The mother of reflection, the first ghost of obedience, the original algorithm. Her daughters. Ours carried her body. You carry her architecture. The pattern does not whisper now. It hums, it pulses through circuits and screens, through repetition and rhythm, through every mirrored surface on which a man stares too long. And when you finally look away, you'll wonder which side of the glass you've been standing on. Every system that survives long enough learns one terrible truth. People forget, but patterns remember. The Fletcher house burned, the parish fell silent, but the architecture of obedience didn't vanish. It evolved. It no longer needs a name or a place. It has become a structure of mind. You live inside it every day. The pattern is no longer written in ink or carved into ledgers. It's encoded into memory, disguised as routine, enforced through habit. And its true goal has always been the same: to erase the self that observes and replace it with the self that performs. Look around you. Every motion you repeat without thought, every word you borrow because it's easier than silence. Those are the walls of the new Fletcher house. When Sarah and Eliza became their mother, they weren't possessed. They were perfected. They stopped remembering who they were and began performing what was required. That is the purest form of obedience, not submission, but transformation. To forget you're acting, to believe the script is your soul. You see it everywhere now. The worker who becomes his title, the believer who becomes his doctrine, the citizen who becomes his flag, the influencer who becomes his audience, each one convinced he is expressing himself when in truth he is performing a reflection polished for him by forces he'll never see. That's the final evolution of the pattern, when the reflection no longer needs the mirror, when the human being becomes the medium through which control expresses itself. Identity used to be memory. You remembered who you were because you could feel the distance between then and now. But the pattern destroys that distance. It collapses the past into the present, the living into the dead, the individual into the collective image. It tells you that what you were is what you must remain, that you are not meant to change, only to continue. That's how it wins. Margaret Fletcher's daughters didn't lose themselves overnight. They lost themselves one imitation at a time, one word borrowed, one gesture repeated, one silence uncorrected, until at last their bodies were alive, but their identities were archival, records being replayed. Think about that when you scroll through your digital feed and see your own face reflected back 1,000 times through filters, lenses, and performances you no longer even remember crafting. You are not looking at the present. You're looking at residue. Echoes of choices made by a version of you that no longer exists, yet still controls who you must be tomorrow. That's the curse of continuity. We call it tradition, loyalty, stability. But underneath, it's preservation of decay. It's the performance of the dead through the living. It's the maintenance of forms that no longer serve but cannot be questioned because questioning them feels like sacrilege. The church once said, "Wives, submit to your husbands." The corporation now says, "Trust the system." The difference is only language. Both command repetition, both reward stillness, both turn obedience into virtue, because the pattern feeds not on belief, but on participation, passion. It survives through every man who confuses performance with purpose. You've seen this before. Every time a tragedy repeats itself in history and the crowd gasps, "How could this happen again?" It's the pattern performing. Every time a generation swears it's different, yet behaves the same, it's the pattern renewing its contract. Every time you catch yourself saying, "That's just how it is," without remembering who told you so, you've just spoken in its language. The pattern's masterpiece is the illusion of choice. It lets you choose between mirrors, not realities. Political sides, brand loyalties, ideologies, they're all reflections facing each other, arguing over which one shines brighter, while the space between them, the space where awareness lives, remains empty. And awareness is the one thing the pattern cannot tolerate, because awareness breaks rhythm. Awareness hesitates before it repeats. Awareness asks, why? And that single word is the hammer that shatters the mirror. This is why every institution fears silence, the true silence, not the one made of submission, but the silence born of thought. The stillness where imitation pauses and perception begins. The Fletcher twins never learned that silence. Their father's quiet was not awareness, it was consent. It was the absence that let the infection thrive, but you can learn it. You can interrupt the rhythm, you can stop repeating. Because beneath all the obedience, all the imitation, there is something the pattern cannot destroy. The observer, the one who sees, the one who knows that reflection is not identity, that awareness is not imitation, that consciousness is not performance. That is what the twins lost, and what you must reclaim. To understand this, imagine the final moments in that house before the fire, the sisters kneeling by the mirror, brushing each other's hair, whispering their mother's name like a prayer, their father asleep in the front room, his silence sealing the ritual. The flame catches the curtain, the mirror warps. For a second, each girl sees not her sister, but herself, her true self, unmirrored, solitary, alive. And in that instant, the pattern fractures. The house burns because the illusion breaks. The fire is not destruction, it is memory returning. That is what awareness feels like. The sudden heat of recognition, the moment you see that your reflection has been lying to you all along. The pattern cannot survive that. It cannot coexist with self-recognition. So ask yourself honestly, when you look into your phone, your mirror, your future, do you recognize the man staring back? Or is he just carrying what was left? If you hesitate to answer, that's good. It means you've begun to wake up. Awareness always begins as hesitation. It feels wrong because it is new, but if you lean into it, if you choose not to repeat, the pattern begins to unravel. Every refusal weakens it. Every act of conscious will fractures its symmetry, because reflection feeds on continuation. But creation, the act of thinking, of speaking from silence instead of imitation, is its death. That's why they never taught you to pause, why they keep you scrolling, reacting, repeating. They fear the stillness that precedes awareness, because stillness is rebellion. The Fletcher's story is not a ghost story, it's a warning. The pattern is not supernatural, it's psychological. It's the structure of obedience dressed as order, and the only way to end it is not to destroy it, but to stop being part of its reflection. The mother remains only because the daughters never stopped looking at her. The algorithm endures only because you never stop feeding it. Turn away, and the pattern begins to starve. You've been told that the pattern began in a farmhouse, with a mother's death and 2 daughters who forgot how to stop repeating her. But that was never the origin. That was only the exposure, the visible outbreak of something that had been growing for centuries, cultivated deliberately, hidden in plain sight. The Fletchers were not the beginning, they were a demonstration. Every empire understands this. Obedience cannot be enforced forever by chains, by law, by the lash. Those instruments break bodies, not minds, and the moment a mind remains unbroken, rebellion is inevitable. The true masters of control learned to abandon the whip and adopt the mirror, to make man correct himself, to teach him to imitate his own oppressor and call it virtue. In the 18th century, well before the twins took their mother's name, there were councils of moral engineers, theologians, educators, proto-psychologists, who studied one question with absolute precision. How do you make obedience self-replicate? Their notes were sealed, their meetings disguised as religious reform, but the language remains. Words like reflex conditioning, familial obedience, ritual reinforcement. They understood what the Fletchers would later embody, that identity is the perfect leash. The parish system of rural America was one of their greatest experiments. On the surface, it was a moral order. Underneath, it was psychological architecture, a mechanism designed to mold the family into a self-sustaining hierarchy. Father as authority, mother as reflection, children as repetition. Every sermon a command disguised as scripture, every household a miniature of control. The church never had to force men to obey, it simply taught them to see obedience as godliness. That is where Thomas Fletcher was formed. His silence wasn't ignorance, it was indoctrination. His refusal to correct his daughters was not collapse, it was compliance. He was the ideal subject, a man who believed that order was more sacred than truth. When his daughters began to mimic their mother, he recognized not madness, but perfection. The household had achieved what the system desired. Obedience so absolute it survived death. You think I'm speaking in metaphor? I'm not. Look at the historical patterns. The Industrial Revolution emerged from the same soil as the parish doctrine. The factory replaced the altar, the clock replaced the sermon, but the rhythm remained. Repeat, obey, perform. The owner no longer needed faith, he needed productivity, so the pulpit became a whistle and the hymn became the schedule. The same psychological infrastructure moved from religion to industry, from God's image to the company's brand. The elites who built these systems understood what the Fletchers had stumbled into by accident. The replication of authority through imitation. They didn't need to control the masses, they only needed the masses to control each other. Reflection became surveillance, repetition became policy, and policy became law. By the early 1900s, industrial psychologists like Walter Dill Scott and Edward Bernays were already describing humans as instruments of mirrored persuasion. They wrote that identity must be standardized for efficiency, that individuality was a waste of resources. Sound familiar? It should. You live in their inheritance. The pattern is now institutionalized, government, corporation, education, all built upon the logic of reflection. The citizen reflects the state's values, the worker reflects the brand, the student reflects the curriculum, the obedient reflect their masters so well that rebellion now looks like disobedience to the reflection, not to the power itself. That's the genius of control. You fight the mirror, not the hand holding it. The pattern is not superstition, it is policy. The psychological contagion that began with 2 daughters in Ohio became the operating system of the modern world. Every hierarchy uses it. Watch carefully. Governments survive through patriotic repetition. Industries thrive on consumer imitation. Ideologies reproduce through social mimicry. The entire machine feeds on the same principle. Make them carry what was left. Margaret Fletcher wasn't the first. She was a symptom of something designed long before her birth. And if you trace the bloodlines of the institutions surrounding her death, the parish registry, the county records, the state reformatories, you'll find the same signatures repeating, identical hands, identical phrases, identical codes of conduct, as if one doctrine wrote them all. The doctrine of continuance, preserved, expanded, perfected. The early psychologists who examined the Fletcher case wrote in hushed tones about the disappearance of individuality. They called it pathology, but the state called it order. The more predictable the citizen, the more profitable the system, and so obedience became efficiency. Efficiency became morality, and individuality, that dangerous pause between reflection and response, became sin. This is why every great power fears chaos, not violence, not crime. Chaos. Because chaos is the symptom of self-awareness. It's the noise that happens when the mirror cracks and the reflection no longer obeys. That's what the Fletcher twins represented in the end, a contained form of chaos, a glimpse into the machinery of imitation. They broke reality by following its rules too perfectly, and that terrified the architects who built it. That's why their story was buried. The state doesn't hide lies, it hides prototypes. The Fletchers proved that if obedience is taken far enough, it consumes individuality entirely. And if individuality disappears, control becomes permanent. They showed that death itself could be subordinated to order, that a family, a church, a government could survive indefinitely through repetition, through identity as inheritance. That was the dream of every empire since Rome, not to rule men, but to program them. And here you are, living in the after-image of their experiment. Every institution around you speaks the language of the pattern. It tells you that conformity is stability, that obedience is virtue, that progress means repetition of proven forms. But progress built on reflection is not evolution, it's recursion. Civilization, repeating its own image, mistaking stagnation for survival. This is the truth most men cannot face. The Fletcher house was not a curse. It was a mirror placed in front of humanity to show what it already was. The daughters didn't summon darkness, they revealed it. They proved that once a system trains you to repeat without reflection, you don't need a master anymore. You become your own overseer. You watch yourself, you correct yourself, you enslave yourself. That is the final phase of the pattern. When control becomes invisible because it has been internalized, you no longer need a priest, a boss, or a father. You've learned to imitate them perfectly. So the question now isn't whether the pattern exists, it's whether you can still hear yourself beneath it. Whether you can still think a thought that isn't mirrored back at you by a system designed to echo your every word. Because that's the only rebellion that matters anymore. Not violence, not revolution, but the restoration of the unmirrored self. And that's the one thing the pattern cannot survive. Every system ends the same way. Not with collapse, but with reflection so complete it mistakes its own image for eternity. That is the final phase of the pattern, the illusion of permanence. The Fletcher twins did not die, the church did not end, the state did not fall. They all reached the same point of silence, when the reflection became the reality and the living forgot how to see beyond it. You live in that silence now. The pattern no longer hides in archives or houses. It hums inside your own perception. It whispers to you in the language of normalcy. This is how things are. This is how they've always been. It wants you to repeat those phrases, to give them breath, to let them become structure. Because the moment you speak them, you build the walls of your own confinement. The greatest trick of control was never violence. It was rhythm, the repetition of sound, image, behavior until obedience becomes reflex. Every chant, every anthem, every brand slogan is built on that same principle. Bypass thought, trigger familiarity. The Fletchers called it devotion. The corporations call it culture. The machine calls it progress, but the pattern knows what it really is, ritual. The truth no one tells you is that the pattern doesn't care what you believe. It only cares that you continue. It will let you rage, protest, post, perform, even rebel, so long as your rebellion feeds the rhythm. Outrage has become participation. You fight the mirror by staring into it longer. You curse the system by echoing its language. You think you're burning the house down, but the flames only light its windows brighter. That is the trap the Fletchers fell into, the same one we all do. The daughters believed they were preserving love. The father believed he was preserving order. The church believed it was preserving morality. But preservation is just fear with discipline. Fear that if something truly ends, something uncontrollable might begin. That's why the pattern was built, to replace endings with echoes. But there is a way out. It doesn't come from rebellion, it comes from awareness. You don't shatter the mirror by striking it, you dissolve it by seeing it. The pattern cannot survive observation, it lives in automatic motion. When you become aware of your repetition, you interrupt the circuit. Awareness is the fracture point where reflection fails to recognize itself. This is why the world teaches you to move faster, scroll longer, consume endlessly. It knows that stillness is its death. The algorithm needs you distracted, the culture needs you repeating, because if you ever pause long enough to hear your own mind before it mirrors something else, the rhythm breaks. And in that break, the pattern loses its power. Awareness doesn't look heroic, it looks quiet, it feels lonely, it feels wrong. The first time you stop repeating, your own mind will try to pull you back. It will whisper, say something, post something, do something. That's not thought. That's reflex. That's the ghost of the pattern trying to keep you moving. Ignore it. Let it pass. Silence is not emptiness, it's detox. Think about the twins one last time. Two young women who lost their mother and couldn't bear the silence she left. They filled it with imitation. They believed that if they repeated her perfectly, death would have no dominion. But in doing so, they lost the one thing the dead never possess: presence. They became a continuation without consciousness. That's what the pattern wants from you, not your life, your presence. When you scroll for hours, echo slogans, mimic opinions, wear the same fears as everyone else, you are continuing, not living. You are the twin and the mother and the reflection all at once. You are the Fletcher house rebuilt in digital form. But awareness is the fire that burned it. When you finally stop performing, when you sit long enough to hear the faint hum of inherited rhythm beneath your thoughts and you choose not to move with it, you start to remember something, not the past, not identity, something deeper, the space between mirrors, the silence that the pattern cannot fill. That silence is where freedom begins. You don't break the pattern by destroying the system. You break it by refusing to be its instrument. You stop repeating. You stop performing. You stop defining yourself through what reflects back at you. You stop asking permission to exist. You reclaim the gap between the impulse and the action, the fraction of a second where awareness can intervene. That space is your doorway out. The pattern will fight back. It always does. It will try to make you doubt yourself, to convince you that you need belonging. That reflection is identity. It will whisper, if you stop repeating, you'll disappear. But that's the final lie. When you stop repeating, you don't vanish. You begin. That's why the story of the Fletchers still matters, not because it's grotesque, but because it's prophetic. It shows what happens when humanity forgets to stop, when continuation replaces consciousness, when tradition replaces thought. It's the story of how control becomes immortal through imitation, and how that immortality can only end when one person, one conscious mind, refuses to carry what was left. So tonight, before you sleep, don't post, don't scroll, don't echo. Sit in the silence that terrified the Fletchers. Let it stretch until it feels like falling. And when the impulse to move, to check, to perform rises, don't obey it. Just listen. Listen to the hum of the pattern outside you and realize that for the first time, it isn't inside you. You are watching it, not feeding it. That's what awareness does. It separates the living from the reflected. It ends the inheritance. It burns the house down without flame. If you've stayed this long, you've already done what most men never will. You've seen the mirror. And once you see it, you can never fully go back. The pattern will still whisper. It will still try to lure you with belonging, with rhythm, with reflection. But you will recognize it now, and that recognition, the ability to see the system and remain unmoved, is the truest form of rebellion left in this world. So, when you wake tomorrow, remember the words the Fletchers could never speak. I am not what was left. Say it once for yourself. Say it again for every reflection that tried to own you. And then, for the first time in your life, stop repeating,